I'm so glad that he's able to be here. You know, about a month ago, I was thinking about this afternoon. About a month ago, we were able to go over to Glen Street Church of Christ and have a singing night over there. Let me tell you something. We certainly enjoyed that. There was probably, 25 or so of our members that went over there and had a fantastic time just singing with your congregation and with the Swifton Church as well that was there. So just a wonderful time. We thank you so much for being here tonight. So we're looking forward to your lesson on humility. I remember a few years ago I did a lesson on humility, and for me anyway, you never really feel worthy to do a lesson on humility. You know, you can't get up there and say, listen, I've got this humility thing figured out, you know. So it's an awkward thing to talk about, but we know that you'll do such a fantastic job. Let's sing number 712. 712. We'll just sing verses 1 and 3. Verses 1 and 3. Let's stand as we sing this one. This is a standing song. Troublesome times are here, filling men's hearts with fear. Freedom we all hold dear, now's at stake. Humbling your heart to God, safe from the chastening rod. Seek the way pilgrims trod, Christians awake. Jesus is coming soon, morning or night or noon. Many will meet their doom, trumpets will sound. All of the dead shall rise, righteous meet in the skies, going where no one dies, heavenward bound. Troubles will soon be o'er, happy forevermore, when we meet on that shore, free from all care. Rising up in the sky, telling this world goodbye. Homeward we then will fly, glory to share. Jesus is coming soon, morning or night or noon. Many will meet their doom, trumpets will sound. All of the dead shall rise, righteous meet in the skies, going where no one dies, heavenward bound. May be seated. Let's have a word of prayer. We'll turn it over to Brother Tom. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for our time together tonight already in singing songs of praise to you, and for these kids that are here for Vacation Bible School. And help us all to be encouraged and to dig deep to find the great treasures of Jesus. We ask you to be with Tom tonight as he speaks to us about humility. We know that without humility, then Christianity means nothing. And we just appreciate your word that gives us such great guidance on what we need to do to be pleasing to you. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.
It's kind of an that wasn't an epiphany. I think it is. I'll have to tone the voice down now. But up until last year, when y'all came over and visited, whenever I was asked about my home congregation, well, my immediate response, well, it was Alto Road Congregation in Kokomo, Indiana, because that's where I was raised. And, basically they put me on a good path, and I'm thankful for that. And every time I go home to visit, we'd go back, and, I'd always referred to them as my home congregation. But last year, whenever y'all came over for that singing, it became obvious to me that my home congregation had changed. It was y'all. It was North Heights. And that's y'all mean an awful lot to me. And y'all are precious, precious people. And I want to thank y'all for what you've done to help support the work over at Glen Street. I was told I had about 30 minutes. I didn't know how long I was going to ask that question, but I was anticipating about 45. So I don't know if I'm going to get through all this lesson or not, but we'll cover what we can, and then we'll call it quits. At 7:30, we can all go eat cookies if that's what we want to do. As has already been introduced through the skit and the play, tonight's lesson is on humility. And it's really based through the concept or the backdrop of leadership. But I don't want us to come away with this thinking that if I'm not in leadership, then this humility lesson doesn't apply to me, because it applies to all of us as individual Christians. We are all called to greatness as Christians. We're all called to greatness. We are called to be the children of God, are we not? And our names are Christian. We are named after the God of all creation. We bear that name, and with it comes greatness. We are holy, and we are set apart, all of us, individually. And because we are holy and we are set apart, we've been instructed to do what I consider to be very important things, and those things are good works. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10 tells us that we are God's workmanship, created in His likeness to do good works which He has prepared in advance for us to do. And I'm convinced that all of us do good works, and we strive to do the best we can. We try to do important things. Good works are important things. That's what God has made us for. There is nothing more important in our life than to do what God has made us to do. But sometimes we confuse this, us doing important things, we confuse it with a sense of personal importance. And I think that's when we start having issues, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But I think all of us also have within us an appetite for being important. We all want to feel important, and there's an appetite there. And it can even become a lust, a worldly lust. And Satan can use that to get to us as Christians. You think, well, how does Satan attack a weak Christian? Well, there's a lot of ways he can. When we're just coming out of the world and we've got a lot of issues in our lives and difficulties of breaking free from all of our past habits, well, he works on us there. But after we've been with God and clothed ourselves with Him for years and years, and we mature as Christians and we become much more, focused on doing those important things, doing those good things that God wants us to do. Satan has to shift his attack on us, and he attacks us through this appetite for greatness. let's ask this question. Who rules this world? Isn't it those who are important and powerful? When you think about it, it's the important and powerful people who rule this world. But yet Jesus, when he started his ministry, and as it's recorded on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 5, Jesus there says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And meekness, if we understand the concept of what meekness is, it's power under control. As we live in this world today, the powerful people, what the world considers important people, rule it. But Jesus says that ultimately we, those who are meek and humble, will inherit the world. We will rule the world. Our lesson text this morning is taken from Luke chapter 9, and we're going to jump around and look at several different verses this evening. But the text is taken from Luke chapter 9, verses 46 through 48. And we'll read this here, but it's also recorded in Matthew, and there's also another recording of it in Mark as well. But we'll start here with this one in Luke chapter 9, verses 46 through 48. Let me see if I can. My pages are sticking together. Okay, here we go. It says, "An argument started among the disciples." And as he references here in Luke, the disciples, I think he's actually talking about the apostles, the 12 apostles. He says, "An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest." It was an argument. It wasn't just a discussion. When you argue, typically what that means is there's a difference of opinion. And the apostles had differences of opinion as to who was going to be the greatest among them. And as we go through and look at some of these passages, I think we'll come to the conclusion that they were not arguing for someone else to be the greatest. They were arguing for themselves to be the greatest. And it says, "Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. And then he said to them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For he who is least among you, he is the greatest." Jesus had to speak on this subject several times. And, it's as you look through the Gospels, what you'll see is that this issue really grows as Jesus' ministry unfolds. And the apostles have more time to be with Jesus. Even right down toward the end of his ministry, Jesus was still dealing with this issue. Now, when you think about it, when Jesus chose his apostles, this is my perception, I doubt very seriously if Jesus went out and chose some individuals who were very arrogant, thinking that they were the greatest already. As a matter of fact, some of the participants of what we're going to look at here in some of these stories, you have Peter, James, and John, and even Andrew, and they were fishermen. And, they weren't the fishermen who owned the business and just counted the money, but these were the guys out on the boat, working with the nets, putting in the long hours. They weren't managing people. They were just common laborers. And I doubt very seriously if they considered themselves to be worthy of being the greatest in a kingdom. But yet what we'll see as time goes on, as events start rolling out, Satan attacks them. And they start thinking along the lines of who is the greatest. Let's go back and look at some of the growth of this particular problem. As we mentioned, actually it starts in humble beginnings, with them being fishermen. But let's go back and look here at Luke chapter 9. Same chapter, but back just a little bit. And we'll see here where the first part of chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, where Jesus sends out the 12 apostles, and he sends them out to do some things. Starts here in verse 1, says, when Jesus called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and cure diseases. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine what that would have been like? His apostles had seen Jesus do these things. Heal the sick, cast out demons, cure diseases. But now, Jesus says, I'm going to send you 12 out. Send you out in pairs, and I'm going to give you the power to do those things. What would that be like? Can you even imagine what it'd be like? To be given the authority to go out and to heal someone? Oh, how long would it take before you started feeling important, wouldn't it? I'm sure as you start out, you're so blessed that you have the ability to help people who previously didn't have access to help. But the more you would do it, the more you would feel like, oh, I've got a gift. And you may think, as rightly so, I need to share that gift with people. But oh, Satan can start working on you. He can start working on you and make you think that, I'm pretty special. Not only do I have the power to do that, but the Son of God chose who? Chose me. He chose me to have that ability. He didn't pass it out to everyone. He chose me. The story kind of goes on then, and Jesus kind of tests them. He's already given them this power. And I don't, Jesus doesn't explain himself a lot, but you can kind of read between the lines and kind of see what he's doing. He's given them this power, and there's a dance, and he knows it's coming, that they're going to have the ability to change people's lives. He starts out by giving them the power with healing diseases and casting out demons, but it's going to go much further than that. They're going to have the ability to save people, share with them the news that allows people to escape the evil of this world. It's going to be a special thing, but really all of us end up having that same ability. But there's going to be a dance where he's going to give them the ability to do things that they've never been able to do before, and yet they're going to have to do it with the same humility that Jesus himself exhibited. And it's a teaching thing. And that's what Jesus is dealing with here. But if you'll notice in chapter 9 here, as you're looking at Luke, right after he sends them out, there's an event here where Jesus feeds 5,000 people. Actually, it's more than that. It's 5,000 men, not counting women and children. But if you look at that particular event right there, not to read the whole thing, but if you jump down to verse 13, you notice what Jesus tells them? He tells his apostles, because they come and say, we need to send them home. Well, what are we going to do with all these people? And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. Jesus had already given them the power to do miracles. I think he was wanting to know, are you going to use the power that I've given you? And of course we know the story. They weren't able to do that. And so Jesus has them sit down and he feeds all of them. But when it's over, Can you imagine just a little bit? Perhaps maybe they were disappointed when they thought about the events after the end of the day. And maybe among themselves they were talking and said, you know, Jesus gave us the power to do miracles, and He asked us to do something today, and we didn't do it. He had to do it for us after He instructed us to do it. I'd feel, I don't know about you, but I'd feel a little disappointed in myself, wouldn't you? Because Jesus had blessed them with the ability to do something, and I failed to do it. Therefore, I might feel just a little bit disappointed. I think the apostles were a little disappointed in themselves. Well, right after that, you have here Peter's confession. And starts here in verse 18. It says, once when Jesus was praying in private and His disciples were with Him, He asked, who do the crowd say that I am? And they replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life. But what about you, He asked. Who do you say that I am? And who's He talking to here? He's talking to all the apostles. And who speaks up? Peter does, doesn't he? Peter may have been one who was just a little bit disappointed for not stepping out when Jesus gave him the opportunity to feed the 5,000. And now when the question comes up, Peter's the first one. And he says, the Christ of God. Oh, what do those other apostles do? Can't you just see it? We've got to read between the lines, but can't you just see it? Well, there's old Peter. Man, he jumped up there. And he's going to get Jesus' blessing for that, isn't he? You know, that's what he was looking for, and He gave him the right answer. I think you can see a little bit, maybe a competition starting to build among the apostles. Chapter 9, verses 28 through 26. The Transfiguration. That's the next story in the same chapter as we progress through this. And it says here about 8 days later, he says, after Jesus said this, He took Peter, John, and James with Him and went up onto the mountain to pray. Who did He take? Did He take all 12 of them this time? No, He took Peter, James, and John. What about those other 9? Wonder what they're thinking. Well, who are they? Why do they get to go? As best we can tell, and Jesus may have done it earlier, but as best we can tell, this is probably the first time that He separated those 3 out. And He's taken them with Him on a special occasion. But notice what the occasion is about. We know the story. It says that they went up on the mountain to pray, and as He was praying, the appearance of His face changed. His clothes became as bright as flashing lightning. And 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. And they spoke about His departure, which He was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. And Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw His glory and 2 men standing with Him. And as the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Well, that's being equitable, isn't it? You know, we want to be fair about it. One's not greater than the other, is there? All 3 of you will build a shelter for each one of you. I'm sure Peter thought, man, I'm doing the noble thing. I'm doing the smart thing. You know, we'll build 3 here. And it says, as he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my Son in whom I have chosen. Listen to who? To Him. And then the other 2, they're gone, aren't they? And only Jesus is left there. You'd have to think. You just have to. that they started thinking about the idea, the concept of greatness. Jesus must be more important than Moses and Elijah. He must be greater than Moses and Elijah. And you know what? He would be right, would he not? He sure would. He would be right. But the concept of making a distinction of who's greater, you see the wheels start turning? You can almost even make the same assumption. Why was it just Moses and Elijah? Well, what about Jeremiah? What about him? What about David? What about Abraham? Where were they? Where was Ezekiel? Where was Daniel? It wasn't there. It was just Moses and Elijah. So maybe Peter and James and John are thinking, there's a hierarchy thing going on here because there was only three. Now we look back at it, and we say that, and probably rightly so, that Moses, he represented the law, and that Elijah represented all the prophets. That was probably the reasoning behind it. They were well thought of in Jewish culture, so that was probably the reason. But in the way the apostles are starting to think now about who's the greatest, that almost reinforces that type of thinking because just those two showed up. And then Jesus was singled out as being the most important, the greatest. Then we get down here to verse 46, which we've already read. That's where there's an argument now that has started. They're not just discussing things now. There's an argument going on. And we don't get all the nitty-gritty and the dirty stuff. I don't think there's real reason for that to be shared with us. But you can imagine why there's an argument, can't you? Because those three were single. He spoke the other day first. He got going to say that, but no, Peter jumped out there ahead of me. You can see why they might be. Who is the greatest? Thomas is probably thinking, well, man, I'll go with Jesus to his death. He says that just a few weeks later. He says, I'll go with you to die. He should think, well, I should have been one. I deserve to go up there on that mountain too. No, he wasn't though, was he? So you've got these among themselves, they're arguing on who now is going to be the greatest. They didn't start out that way, did they? They didn't start out arguing over that when Jesus selected them to be one of the 12 apostles. Man, they were probably just so thrilled just to be selected by Jesus, just to be one of those. They weren't worried about who was the greatest. But now that this power thing starts showing up, the ability to do things, recognition starts showing up, Satan can work on them now. And they start wondering, well, I wonder who is the greatest. Following this, in verse 49, it says here that John says to Jesus, he says, Master, we saw a man. So we saw another man over here. He was driving out demons. I wonder where he got the ability to do that. That wasn't bothering him, was it? But he said, we saw him driving demons, and we tried to stop him. Isn't that a good thing? We cast a demon out of someone who had possessed someone in their life. You ought to be thankful. You ought to be saying, praise the Lord. We saw this man over here casting this demon. But no, not the case. We tried to stop him. What was the reasoning? Because he's not one of us. And that just shows you how insidious that is, how Satan works. And we're talking good people here, aren't we? We're talking people that personally to take care of the world. Jesus didn't just haphazardly go out there and pick someone. He picked some good men. Those real good men are having problems now amongst themselves over who's the greatest. You wouldn't have thought that 3 years earlier, but now you do. How bad did it get? How bad did it get? Well, if you let's look at Matthew chapter 20. And it's just an indication of how strong this temptation was to them. Matthew chapter 20 and verses 20 through 28. And this is right before, this is the last week of Jesus' life. So that's why I said earlier that it kind of grows, and Jesus had to fight this issue right down to the end. This is right before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, before Jesus is arrested and taken off to be crucified. But here in verse 20 of Matthew chapter 20, it says, "Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and kneeled down, asked a favor of him. 'What is it you want?' he asked. And she said, 'Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom.'" It's so bad now they're bringing Mama in. They're bringing Mama in on their behalf. Oh, look down. Let's just jump real quick down here to verse 24. "When the 10 heard about this, they were what? They were indignant." Oh man, it got beyond just arguing. They are now, they're mad, aren't they? They're mad. I got 3 minutes. Can't do this, Alex. I just can't do it. Jesus talks about his humility. In Matthew chapter 11, he says, and in verse 28 through 30, he talks about taking upon his yoke. And he says, "I am gentle and I am humble at heart." Humble at heart. Jesus, being the Son of God, was the most humble man that ever walked the face of the earth. And he had to get his apostles to understand humility like that. There's one passage that we read quite often. I want us to look at it here real quickly. It's in Philippians chapter 2. Where it's talking about being like-minded. Paul's speaking here, he's writing here, and he's talking about how we should imitate Christ's humility and how we should be like-minded. Down in verse 5, he says, "Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus." He says, "Who being in the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself to become obedient to death, even death on the cross." Now, obviously, as we read this passage here, Paul is referencing Jesus being human and being a servant to people, and humbling himself to die a humiliating death reserved for criminals, a death on the cross. But I think we're missing a little bit. Wherever Paul says here, he made himself nothing. I think it would do us good to stop and think about Jesus and who he was. Jesus was truly God. And you look at all the amazing people in this world, and all the amazing talent that people have in this world, you know who made that talent, who made that ability for those people. God did. God did. The beautiful singers, the beautiful orators, the beautiful, the artist that does, the minds, the mathematicians' mind, the Einsteins, all those, it's just magnificent. What do we know about Jesus? When Jesus started his ministry, you know what they said? Man, he is one of the most awesome carpenters that, kings and queens from all over the world want Jesus to make stuff for them. No. He's just a carpenter's son. He's just a carpenter's son. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have been Jesus? And the things that he could do, we're taught to always do our best, right? To do the best we can, to always put forth our best effort, and life will go good for us, and we'll experience the fulfilled life if we find out what we're real good at and do it. Oh, all the great things that Jesus could have done, but yet, guess what, folks? He didn't do any of those things. He made himself nothing. They didn't even know who he was. He was just a carpenter's son. You talk about humility. You talk about humility. That is humility. That's what we need. That's the kind of person we need to be. Real quickly, can I have just a few more minutes? Real quick. As I said earlier, I got two more points I want to make and we'll close out. We live in an age today that is very different, or at least it looks different than it did when 15, 20 years ago. We live in an age of selfies. Y'all know what selfies are, don't you? Well, you don't have to do that. You got your it'll just turn around. They came up, so it's a whole lot easier to take your own picture. You don't have to turn around and then see what it looks like. It shows up right here, and then you get your sticks and you hold them out there. And y'all know what selfies are, aren't you? I'm not saying it's bad to take a selfie. I'm not saying it's. I'm not going to criticize anyone for that. But we live in of self. We live in an age of Facebook. We post our lives out there, and I'm not saying if you're on Facebook there's anything wrong with that. I'm not saying that at all. We're taking pictures. You can tell, can't you, about some people out there? It's all about, isn't it? Yeah, got the picture. It's me. It's all about who? It's all about me. We need to be careful. We need to be careful, especially as Christians, about thinking too much of ourselves. He gave us a powerful life. He gives us good things to do. But we don't need to be drawing the attention to ourselves. We need to be deflecting that attention back to who? Back to God. Now, fortunately, as most of us know, the apostles got it figured out. They figured out all that competition thing, and you don't see that anymore. They worked their way through it. As a matter of fact, when you get down to Peter even, in writing 1 Peter, he talks about or introduces himself not as an apostle, but as an elder, a servant elder, and how an elder should serve people. He got that bug behind him. He took Satan and he whipped him with it, and we need to do that as well. I want to make one last point, and then I'll close. And this doesn't have anything to do with the lesson. It's the flip side of the coin, okay? Now, I just want to make this one comment. Let's not confuse humility with passivity. Let's not use it as an excuse for not leading. Sometimes we find ourselves being so passive, and we say, I don't want to be so arrogant that I'm so passive. I'm going to step back. I don't want to be a leader. And we think, and what we do is we convince ourselves that we're being humble when we do that. But that's not humility. That's not meekness. That's not power. That's giving it away. And the reason I say this is because this congregation has been so blessed through the years of having good leaders and humble leaders. But I'm working with a church in an area now that there are several churches over there that they don't have leaders. And one of the reasons they don't have any leaders is because they just want to step back. They just want to step back. They don't want to be arrogant. They don't want to be the one to step out in front. But you know what happens? When people that are humble, when they refuse to lead, you know who does lead? It's those leaders who are arrogant. And they find an opportunity, and trust me, they move in. And the church suffers. So there is another flip side of the coin. That's lesson number 2. Maybe someday you'll let me come back and we'll explore that one. But I've went 6 minutes over. I'm sorry. The cookies are probably cold by now, but thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.